The scariest part wasn't that my life went wrong. It was that it went exactly as expected. I did what made sense. I followed advice that sounded responsible. I made choices that didn't alarm anyone. From the outside, my life looked orderly, almost reassuring. A sequence of reasonable decisions stacked neatly on top of each other. And somewhere along the way, I disappeared inside them. I didn't notice it happening. That's important. If I had, I might have fought it. But nothing about the process felt violent or dramatic. It felt like cooperation. Like maturity. Like becoming an adult who understands how the world works. I learned early that being agreeable made things smoother. That saying yes kept doors open. That wanting too much made people uncomfortable. So I adjusted. I trimmed parts of myself that felt excessive. I learned to want things quietly, or not at all. People praised me for being grounded. I took that as a compliment. Every major step in my life felt pre-approved. School. Work. Relationships. None of them were disasters. None of them were bold either. Each one followed naturally from the last, like a path already worn smooth by other people's footsteps. I told myself this was how stability was built. What I didn't realize was that stability without intention slowly becomes a cage you don't know how to leave. I rarely asked myself what I wanted. Not because I didn't care, but because asking felt impractical. Wanting things that didn't align with expectations felt irresponsible. So I focused on what was reasonable instead of what was alive. Over time, my inner voice softened. Not silenced, just lowered. Like background noise you stop noticing because it's always there. Decisions became easier because I stopped consulting myself. That felt like progress. I wasn't conflicted anymore. I was efficient. People trusted me. Relied on me. Saw me as someone steady, predictable, safe. I fulfilled roles well. I met obligations. I showed up on time. I did what was needed. Inside, I felt strangely absent. Not unhappy enough to complain. Not inspired enough to change. Just, present enough to function and distant enough not to feel. That in-between state lasted for years. I remember moments when something inside me tried to surface. A quiet dissatisfaction. A question about whether this was really my life. I ignored those moments politely. Told myself everyone feels this way sometimes. That adulthood is about compromise. So I compromised. Again. And again. And again. Until compromise became my personality. I stopped imagining different futures because imagining made the present harder to tolerate. I stopped expressing strong opinions because neutrality kept things calm. I stopped pushing back because pushing back required energy I didn't feel entitled to spend. I wasn't depressed. I was contained. Contained people don't alarm anyone. They just slowly disappear. The first time I felt truly uneasy was during a conversation that should have been harmless. Someone asked me what I would change about my life if I could. I laughed. Deflected. Gave a vague answer that sounded thoughtful but meant nothing. Later that night, alone, the question returned. And this time, I didn't laugh. I couldn't think of an answer, not because there was nothing to change, but because I had lost the habit of imagining myself as someone allowed to choose. That realization landed heavily. I had lived the life everyone expected. I had followed the script well enough that no one questioned my presence in it. I had done everything right in a way that left no room for me. And the most unsettling part was this: no one noticed anything missing. Because I had slowly trained them not to look. I hadn't been forced into this life. I had agreed to it, quietly, repeatedly, without ever stopping to ask what it was costing me. That night, for the first time in years, I felt something sharp and unmistakable: grief. Not for a specific loss. But for myself. For the version of me that might have existed if I had ever asked whether the life I was living was actually mine, or just convenient for everyone else. Once I allowed myself to feel that grief, I couldn't put it back where it had been. It didn't explode. It settled. Like dust in a room I had kept closed for too long. I began to notice how carefully my life was constructed to avoid discomfort. Every routine served a purpose. Every choice minimized friction. Every decision fit neatly into what others considered sensible. I had built a life that functioned perfectly, as long as I didn't ask too many questions. And now I couldn't stop asking. I saw how often I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. How quickly I dismissed dissatisfaction because it didn't rise to the level of crisis. I had learned to believe that suffering only counted if it was visible, dramatic, undeniable. Quiet unhappiness didn't qualify. So I tolerated it. I realized how deeply I feared disappointing people. How much of my identity had been shaped by being dependable, reasonable, low maintenance. I had internalized the idea that my value came from not complicating things. I didn't want to be a problem. So I solved myself out of the equation. That pattern ran everywhere. In my work, where I accepted roles that fit my skills but never stretched my soul. In my relationships, where I adapted so well that my needs became theoretical. In my inner life, where I translated desire into practicality until it lost its original meaning. I wasn't lying to anyone. I was omitting myself. The internal breakdown arrived as a loss of orientation. I felt like I was standing in a familiar place with no sense of direction. I could move, but I didn't know where toward was anymore. I had followed expectations for so long that they had replaced instinct. That scared me. Because instincts can be ignored, but they don't disappear. They wait. And when they finally surface, they don't ask politely. They ache. I began to feel anger, not explosive, but precise. Anger at how easily I had accepted a life that didn't ask me to be present. Anger at how often I had chosen approval over alignment. Anger at how long I had confused being good with being absent. I didn't direct that anger outward. There was no one to blame. That made it heavier. I started seeing how many of my decisions were driven by avoidance rather than intention. I didn't choose things because I wanted them. I chose them because they were safe, familiar, defensible. I could explain them. An explanation had become my shield. If I could justify a choice logically, I didn't have to feel it emotionally. I didn't have to ask whether it fulfilled me. I didn't have to risk wanting more than was offered. That realization cut deep. Because it meant I hadn't been unlucky. I had been careful. And careful had cost me something I couldn't get back. The moral dilemma emerged slowly, but once it was clear, it was impossible to ignore. Do you continue living a life that works, one that keeps everyone comfortable and never collapses, even if it feels hollow? Or do you disrupt it by admitting that the right choices were never aligned with who you are? Staying felt responsible. Leaving felt selfish. At least, that's how I had been trained to see it. I told myself I had obligations. Commitments. A reputation for being steady. I had built something functional, walking away from it felt like ingratitude. But then another thought appeared, quiet and devastating. If this life is so right, why do I feel so far away from it? That question stripped the justifications bare. I realized how afraid I was of being seen as inconsistent. Of changing my mind. Of admitting that the version of myself people trusted might no longer exist. I had lived so long as a role that stepping out of it felt like betrayal. Not of others. Of expectations. And expectations, I was learning, are powerful because they don't shout. They don't threaten. They simply wait for you to keep complying. I thought about how many years I could continue like this. Another 5. 10. 20. I imagined myself older, still doing everything right, still being praised for reliability, still wondering quietly when my life would start to feel like mine. That image frightened me more than any risk ever had. Because nothing was wrong enough to force change. Which meant change would have to be chosen. I understood then that starting over doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like admitting that the life you built without asking yourself what you wanted is no longer sustainable. Not because it's broken. But because you are. I stood at that internal edge for a long time. Not making a move yet. Just letting the truth settle without rushing to fix it. Because once you admit that you've lived someone else's version of a good life, you can't unsee it. And pretending after that becomes unbearable. I didn't know how to return to myself. I wasn't even sure who that self was anymore. But I knew this, continuing to live a life that everyone expected, at the cost of my own presence, was no longer something I could do unknowingly. The awareness had arrived. And awareness changes the price of staying the same. The moment I finally stepped outside the life everyone expected, it didn't feel brave. It felt irresponsible. That was the word that echoed in my head as I hesitated: irresponsible, ungrateful, unstable. Every label I had spent years avoiding lined up neatly, ready to be applied the second I stopped complying. I didn't make a dramatic exit. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't announce anything with conviction. I simply stopped pretending that the life I was living still belonged to me. That decision was quieter than fear had promised. No alarms. No collapse. Just a subtle shift, like leaning in a direction I had never allowed myself to lean before. The first consequences arrived immediately. Not externally, internally. I felt disoriented. Without expectations to guide me, I didn't know how to move. I had relied on what makes sense for so long that acting on feeling felt childish, unsafe, almost forbidden. I realized how little practice I had with desire. Wanting something without a justification felt exposed. Choosing without being able to explain myself felt reckless. I had trained myself to believe that if a choice couldn't be defended logically, it didn't deserve to exist. So the early steps were awkward. I changed small things first. Said no without replacing it with an apology. Questioned routines I had never examined. Allowed dissatisfaction to sit in the open instead of being managed away. Each change felt disproportionately difficult. Because I wasn't just changing behavior. I was dismantling an identity built on being acceptable. Some people noticed. Not with anger, with confusion. They asked careful questions. Made gentle jokes. Tried to place me back into the version of myself they understood. When that didn't work, a few stepped back. That hurt more than I expected. Because it confirmed something painful. Part of my value had been tied to how predictable I was. To how little space I took. To how reliably I met expectations without asking for anything in return. Letting go of that role meant losing a certain kind of safety. But something else emerged in its place. Presence. Not confidence. Not certainty. Presence. I started feeling my days again, not as tasks to be completed, but as experiences that required my participation. Time slowed in strange ways. Moments felt heavier, sharper, more demanding. That was uncomfortable. But it was also alive. I didn't suddenly discover a hidden passion or a perfect path. That's another lie people tell about starting over, that clarity is waiting on the other side. It wasn't. What I found instead was honesty. I didn't know what I wanted yet. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if this new direction would lead anywhere meaningful. But for the first time, I knew that the uncertainty belonged to me. That mattered. Regret surfaced more often after that. Not less. Acting didn't erase the years I had lived quietly inside expectations. It illuminated them. Every choice reminded me how long I had deferred myself. I let that regret exist. Because regret is the cost of awareness, and awareness is still better than sleepwalking. I began to understand that living right and living honestly are not the same thing. One earns approval. The other demands courage. One keeps things stable. The other keeps you present. I had chosen stability for so long that presence felt foreign. But slowly, I adapted. Not by becoming louder or more decisive, but by staying when it would have been easier to retreat. By allowing discomfort to mean something instead of treating it as a signal to stop. I learned that being seen is not the same as being judged. That disappointing expectations is not the same as disappointing people. That losing approval does not equal losing worth. Those lessons didn't arrive all at once. They arrived through repetition. Through moments where I spoke honestly and survived. Through choices that felt wrong at first and later revealed themselves as necessary. Through days that were messy but unmistakably mine. I didn't rebuild my life into something impressive. I rebuilt it into something real. Some days, I still miss the old version of me, the one who knew exactly how to behave, how to be liked, how to move through life without friction. That version was efficient, polite, safe. But that version wasn't living. It was functioning. I understand now how easily a life can be lost without tragedy. Not through failure, but through compliance. Through saying yes when silence would have been more honest. Through choosing what's expected over what's true often enough that truth feels optional. If you're listening to this and you feel like your life looks right but feels distant, I want to tell you something without romance or exaggeration: you don't have to destroy everything to start living. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to be fearless. You only have to stop confusing being acceptable with being alive. I lived the life everyone expected. I did everything right. And quietly, carefully, I lost myself inside it. Finding my way back didn't require permission. It required something harder, letting go of the version of me that everyone recognized, so I could finally recognize myself again. Not proudly. Not perfectly. But honestly. And that, I've learned, is the only way a life actually belongs to you.